Sometimes the things we think we're protecting people from end up destroying us both. I'm 31 now, and it's been 2 years since my world completely imploded over something that happened on a single night in Chicago. My name is Adeline, and I spent the better part of 4 years believing I was the hero of my own story, the woman who made a terrible mistake but had the wisdom to handle it maturely. Turns out I was wrong about almost everything. I met Garrett at a mutual friend's birthday party in 2018. He was this steady, reliable guy who worked in logistics management and had his life together in all the ways that mattered to me at 26. He owned a small house with an actual yard, paid his bills on time, and never made me wonder where I stood with him. After years of dating guys who treated relationships like extended auditions, Garrett felt like coming home. We moved in together after 10 months, and I genuinely loved our quiet life. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, Sunday dinners with his parents, the kind of predictable routine that would have bored me senseless in my early 20s, but felt perfect now. Garrett wasn't the most exciting man I'd ever dated, but he was kind and consistent, and I thought those qualities would matter more in the long run than butterflies and drama. The problem started about 18 months into our relationship when my company began working more closely with our sister office in Denver. That's where I first encountered Dalton. Dalton was everything Garrett wasn't: quick-witted, charming in that dangerous way that makes smart women do stupid things. He was a marketing coordinator with an easy smile and the kind of confidence that fills up a room. Our initial interactions were purely professional, but there was an undercurrent of attraction that I told myself was harmless. Everyone has workplace crushes. The key is not acting on them. But Dalton and I started emailing more frequently as our projects overlapped. Nothing inappropriate, just work-related messages that gradually became more personal. He'd ask about my weekend plans or make jokes about our ridiculous corporate training videos. I found myself checking my email more often, looking forward to his messages in a way that should have been a red flag. When our companies announced a joint conference in Chicago for the spring of 2020, right before everything shut down, I knew Dalton would be there. I told myself I was looking forward to the professional networking opportunities, but I bought a new dress specifically for the welcome dinner and spent an hour on my hair that first morning. The conference itself was fine. Panels about digital marketing trends and customer retention strategies that I'd forget within a month. But the real action happened after hours. On the second night, a group of us ended up at the hotel bar after the official dinner. Garrett texted me around 10, asking how things were going, and I sent back something casual about boring presentations and expensive drinks. By midnight, it was just Dalton and me still at the bar, talking about everything except work. He told me about his divorce 2 years earlier, how he'd married too young and grown apart from his ex-wife. I found myself sharing things about my relationship with Garrett that I'd never said out loud, how sometimes I felt like I was playing house instead of actually living, how I wondered if I'd chosen security over passion. The bartender called last call, and Dalton suggested we continue the conversation in his room. I knew exactly what I was agreeing to, but I told myself I was just extending an interesting discussion with a colleague. The lie felt thin even as I was telling it to myself. What happened next wasn't some passionate, overwhelming moment that swept me away. It was a deliberate choice made by someone who wanted to feel desired and chosen rather than simply tolerated. Dalton made me feel like the most fascinating woman in the world, and I let myself believe it for one night. I woke up the next morning with the sharp clarity that only comes with spectacular poor judgment. Dalton was still sleeping, and I gathered my clothes as quietly as possible and slipped back to my own room. I stood under the shower for 20 minutes, trying to wash away the evidence and the guilt, but mostly feeling angry at myself for being so predictable. The flight home was torture. I kept replaying every moment from the night before, analyzing what it meant and what I was going to do about it. By the time we landed, I'd made my decision. It never happened. This wasn't some elaborate rationalization or self-deception. I made a practical choice based on the facts. I'd had sex with someone I barely knew while in a committed relationship. It was wrong, it was over, and telling Garrett would only hurt him without serving any useful purpose. The responsible thing was to learn from my mistake and make sure it never happened again. The guilt was a physical thing for the first few weeks after I got home. It sat in my chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe normally when Garrett would kiss me hello or tell me he missed me while I was away. I found myself overanalyzing every interaction, looking for signs that he suspected something or that I was acting differently than usual. But Garrett was the same as always, asking about the conference presentations, complaining about a difficult client, planning our weekend around a new hiking trail he'd found online. I started going to the gym obsessively, telling myself it was to get in shape for summer, but really because the physical exhaustion helped quiet the noise in my head. I'd run on the treadmill until my legs shook, then sit in my car afterward feeling empty enough to go home and pretend everything was normal. Garrett praised my new dedication to fitness, saying he was proud of my commitment to health, which only made the guilt worse. 3 weeks after Chicago, I got an email from Dalton that made my heart stop. The subject line was "following up," which sounded innocent enough that I opened it at work without thinking. But the message was anything but professional. He thanked me for an incredible evening and suggested we find another conference to attend together soon. He ended with "thinking of you" and a winking emoji that made me feel sick with panic. I deleted the email immediately and blocked his address, but the damage was done. The fantasy that I could simply forget about what happened crumbled completely. Dalton wasn't treating our night together as a meaningless mistake. He was treating it as the beginning of something ongoing. I realized I had no idea what kind of person I'd slept with or what his expectations might be going forward. For several sleepless nights, I imagined scenarios where Dalton showed up at my office or contacted Garrett directly. I pictured him telling mutual colleagues about our night together, turning it into workplace gossip that would eventually reach the wrong ears. Every email notification made my pulse spike, and I found myself avoiding company-wide messages and inter-office communications because I was afraid of seeing his name. The worst part was how hyper-aware I became of Garrett's trust in me. He'd leave his phone unlocked on the kitchen counter while he showered, never thinking to hide his conversations or email. He'd mention running errands and ask if I needed anything, assuming I'd tell him if I had plans of my own. The casual, complete faith he had in me felt like a weight I couldn't carry, but I was too afraid of the alternative to set it down. I started having dreams about confessing everything to Garrett. Sometimes he forgave me, sometimes he left immediately. Sometimes the conversation kept looping without resolution until I woke up exhausted. In the dreams where he forgave me, I always felt relief so intense it was almost painful. But when I'd imagine actually having that conversation in real life, my mind would immediately jump to all the reasons why honesty would hurt him more than help him. A month after Chicago, when the guilt had started to feel more manageable, I ran into Dalton at a regional marketing meeting that I'd forgotten he might attend. He approached me during the lunch break with that same confident smile, acting like we were old friends catching up. When he suggested we grab coffee afterward to talk about potential collaborations, I told him firmly that I was in a committed relationship and wasn't interested in any interactions outside of work requirements. He looked genuinely surprised, as if our night together had given him some permanent claim on my attention. "I thought we had a connection," he said, loud enough that a few colleagues nearby could overhear. I felt my face burn with embarrassment and anger, both at him for not understanding the boundaries and at myself for creating this situation in the first place. That encounter clarified something important for me. Dalton wasn't someone who understood discretion or appropriate workplace behavior. He was exactly the kind of person who might eventually cause problems if I didn't shut down any possibility of future contact. I spent the drive home crafting a polite but firm email explaining that our interaction in Chicago had been a mistake I regretted, and that I expected all future communication between us to be strictly professional. I threw myself into being the perfect girlfriend with the dedication of someone training for the Olympics. I started cooking Garrett's favorite meals twice a week, planned weekend trips to places he'd mentioned wanting to visit, and generally acted like a woman who'd remembered how lucky she was to have such a wonderful man. Garrett proposed 6 months later at the same friend's birthday party where we'd met. He'd hidden the ring in a cupcake, which was exactly the kind of sweet, slightly dorky gesture that made me love him. I said yes without hesitation because I genuinely wanted to marry him. The night with Dalton felt like something that had happened to someone else entirely. Our wedding was beautiful. Small ceremony in his parents' backyard, reception at the community center where we'd taken dance lessons. I felt radiant in my grandmother's altered dress, surrounded by everyone we loved most. When people tell you that keeping secrets makes you feel fake during important moments, they're wrong. I felt completely present and happy because I was exactly where I wanted to be. The first 2 years of marriage were genuinely wonderful. We bought a house, adopted a rescue dog named Buster, fell into the comfortable rhythms of shared life. I'd completely stopped thinking about that night in Chicago. It had no bearing on my actual life or my real relationship. But Dalton apparently thought about it more than I did. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was working from home, trying to finish a presentation for the quarterly review. Unknown number, which I normally ignore, but something made me answer. "Adeline, this is Cassandra Mills. I think we need to talk." I didn't recognize the name or the voice, but something in her tone made my stomach clench. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" "I'm Dalton's wife." "Well, I was until yesterday." And he had some very interesting things to tell me about a conference in Chicago 2 years ago. The world went very quiet. I could hear Buster barking at something in the backyard, the hum of my laptop fan, the sound of my own heart beating too fast. Cassandra explained that she'd discovered her husband's pattern of conference affairs. Apparently, I wasn't his first or his last. When she'd confronted him with evidence of his most recent betrayal, he'd confessed to everything, including our night together. She was calling everyone on his list, not to cause drama, but because she thought we deserved to know that our secrets weren't as secret as we'd believed. "I figured your husband might want to know what kind of man you spent the night with," she said, her voice brittle with exhaustion. "And what kind of woman he's married to." I tried to convince her that calling Garrett would serve no purpose except to cause unnecessary pain. The night with Dalton had been meaningless, a mistake I'd learned from and never repeated. Why destroy a happy marriage over something that had no impact on our actual relationship? But Cassandra was beyond caring about other people's comfort. She'd spent years living with lies while everyone else got to stay blissfully unaware of the truth. She was done protecting cheating spouses and the people who enabled them. "Your husband deserves to know who he's really married to," she said before hanging up. "Dalton's calling him tonight." I spent the rest of the day in a panic, trying to figure out how to handle this situation. Should I call Garrett first and control the narrative? Should I try to contact Dalton and convince him not to make the call? Should I just hope that somehow this would all blow over without destroying my marriage? In the end, I decided to wait and see what actually happened. Maybe Dalton would change his mind. Maybe Cassandra was bluffing about the phone calls. Maybe I could weather this storm the same way I'd handled the original situation, by staying calm and focused on what really mattered. Garrett came home that evening in his usual good mood, talking about his day and asking about mine. We made dinner together and watched a documentary about penguins. Everything felt completely normal, and I started to think maybe I'd worried for nothing. But the next morning, Garrett's phone rang during breakfast. I watched his face change as he listened to whoever was on the other end. Confusion, then shock, then something harder to read. When he hung up, he looked at me for a long moment before asking, "Is there something you want to tell me about a business trip to Chicago?" I could have tried to lie, but what was the point? Dalton had clearly made his confession, and denial would only make things worse. So I broke down and told Garrett everything about the flirting, about the night with Dalton, about my decision to protect our relationship by keeping it private. I expected him to be hurt and angry, which he was. I expected him to need time to process, which he did. What I didn't expect was for him to be more upset about the lying than about the actual betrayal. "I can understand making a mistake," he said, after I'd finished explaining everything. "What I can't understand is looking me in the eye every day for 2 years and pretending it never happened." What I can't understand is letting me propose to you, letting me marry you, without giving me the choice about whether I wanted to build a life with someone who could do that. We spent the next several weeks in a strange kind of limbo. Garrett moved into the guest room while he processed everything, which mostly seemed to involve analyzing every moment of our relationship for signs of deception. He went through our wedding photos with a detective's eye, looking for evidence of my duplicity in my smile. He questioned the timing of when I'd started being nicer to him, whether my increased affection after Chicago had been genuine or just guilt management. The worst part was that he wasn't entirely wrong. I had been managing the situation, making sure our relationship stayed strong enough to survive if the truth ever came out. But that didn't mean my love for him wasn't real or that our marriage was built on lies. It just meant I'd been protecting something precious to both of us. Garrett started seeing a therapist, which I thought was a positive step, until he came home from sessions with new vocabulary words like betrayal trauma and emotional manipulation. His therapist apparently believed that the deception was actually more damaging than the infidelity, because it showed a pattern of prioritizing my comfort over his right to make informed decisions about his own life. I suggested couples counseling, but Garrett said he needed to work through his individual issues first. Meanwhile, I felt like I was living with a stranger who examined everything I said and did for hidden meanings and ulterior motives. One evening about a month after the truth came out, I found him in his office going through old emails and texts on my laptop. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was trying to figure out what else I might be hiding from him. The violation felt worse than anything I'd done to him. I made one mistake 2 years ago, I told him. One night that meant nothing to me then and means nothing to me now. I'm not some serial cheater hiding multiple affairs. I'm not manipulating or deceiving you. I made a bad choice and then spent 2 years being the best wife I could be. Doesn't that count for anything? But Garrett was stuck in a loop of suspicion and hurt that seemed to get worse instead of better. He'd found a support group for betrayed spouses that met twice a week, and he came home from those meetings with new grievances and fresh ways to frame my actions as fundamentally selfish and dishonest. The turning point came when he asked me to quit my job. Since Dalton worked for our sister company, Garrett decided that my continued employment there represented an ongoing threat to our marriage. Never mind that I rarely interacted with Dalton and had actively avoided him at company events for 2 years. Never mind that my career mattered to me and that starting over at a different company would set me back professionally and financially. "If you're really committed to making this work," Garrett said, "you'll prioritize our marriage over your convenience." That's when I realized we'd moved beyond working through a crisis and into the realm of punishment and control. I told him absolutely not. I wasn't going to sacrifice my professional life because he couldn't handle his own insecurity. The argument that followed was the worst we'd ever had. Garrett accused me of caring more about my job than about our marriage. I accused him of using the situation to control me rather than actually working toward forgiveness. We both said things that probably couldn't be taken back. The next morning, I woke up to find Garrett's wedding ring on the bathroom counter and a note saying he was staying at his brother's place indefinitely. We limped along for another 2 months with occasional texts about practical matters and one disastrous attempt at dinner that ended with both of us in tears. But we both knew it was over. The trust was broken in both directions now. I no longer trusted him not to punish me forever for one mistake, and he no longer trusted me to tell him the truth about anything important. The divorce was finalized 6 months ago. We sold the house and split the proceeds. Garrett got Buster because his schedule was more predictable than mine. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment downtown and tried to figure out how to rebuild my life from scratch. The hardest part wasn't the practical stuff, finding a new place, dividing our belongings, learning to be single again at 30. The hardest part was accepting that I'd been wrong about almost everything. I thought I was protecting Garrett by keeping my mistake private, but what I was really protecting was my own image of myself as a good person who'd made one small error in judgment. I thought the night with Dalton was meaningless because it hadn't changed how I felt about Garrett, but it had changed something fundamental about the foundation of our relationship, whether I acknowledged it or not. Most importantly, I thought that being a good wife after the fact somehow balanced out the betrayal. But what I was really doing was making unilateral decisions about what Garrett deserved to know about his own life and marriage. I don't think I was a monster. I think I was a scared woman who made a series of choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but added up to something much bigger than I understood. I genuinely believed I was doing the right thing by prioritizing our happiness over abstract principles about honesty and disclosure. But Garrett was right about one thing. I'd taken away his ability to make an informed choice about whether he wanted to marry someone who was capable of what I'd done. Maybe he would have chosen to forgive me and move forward together. Maybe he would have decided he couldn't handle it and ended things before we got married. Either way, that choice should have been his to make. I'm dating again now, carefully and with a lot more self-awareness than I had 5 years ago. When the topic of past relationships comes up, I find myself being more honest than feels comfortable. Not because I think every detail of our romantic history belongs to our current partners, but because I understand now that the stories we tell ourselves about our own behavior can become lies we end up living inside. I don't regret the night with Dalton anymore. It taught me something important about the difference between choosing security and choosing love, and it showed me parts of myself I needed to understand better. But I do regret not trusting Garrett enough to tell him the truth when it might have made a difference for both of us. Sometimes protecting someone you love means having difficult conversations instead of making decisions for them. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is trust them to handle the truth, even when you're not sure they'll handle it the way you want them to. I think about Garrett sometimes, wonder if he's happy with whatever life he's built since our divorce. I hope he found someone who can love him with the kind of complete honesty that I was never brave enough to offer. And I hope that, when my turn comes again, I'll have the courage to choose trust over control, even when it's scary. The truth doesn't always set you free, but lies definitely keep you trapped in ways you don't recognize until it's too late. I spent 2 years thinking I'd handled a bad situation with wisdom and maturity, but what I'd really done was build a marriage on a foundation I was too afraid to examine too closely. Now I know better. The next time I love someone enough to want to protect them, I'll start by being brave enough to tell them the truth.